Segue. To continue at once with the next musical selection or composition.
Segue. To make a transition directly from one section or theme to another.
To move smoothly and unhesitatingly from one state, situation, condition, or element to another.
Segue. To perform in the manner of the preceding section.
Segue. To make a transition from one thing to another smoothly and without interruption.
This is Segue with Dean Aldemaro Romero, a weekly program exploring the lives and work of the people of the College of Arts and Sciences at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville.
Hello everybody. Dr. Morris Taylor was born in St. Louis, Missouri. He obtained his bachelor's in liberal studies from St. Louis University, his master's in public administration from Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, and his doctorate on public policy analysis and administration in the area of social jurisprudence from St. Louis University. Today, he's an associate professor and chair of the Department of Public Administration and Policy Analysis at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. Welcome to Segue, Dr. Taylor.
Thank you, Dean Romero. Nice to be here.
While looking at your CV, I found something really interesting there, and it was that you published a piece on Frank Serpico.
Yes.
And of course, for people of our generation, we all saw the movie and heard the news, and he was a big figure. But maybe for the younger audience out there, they don't know what Frank Serpico was. Could you tell us a little bit about his case and what he was so famous about?
Absolutely. Frank Serpico actually was one of my heroes, and the reason he was one of my heroes, I originally, at one point in my life, I worked as a St. Louis police officer. Frank Serpico was a New York City police detective, and during the time he was in New York, there was massive corruption within the New York City Police Department. Frank Serpico was that lone beacon of ethical behavior within the department, and what he tried to do was change the culture of the New York City Police Department almost single-handedly by not taking bribes, by being everything that a police officer was supposed to be in terms of high integrity, in terms of protecting and serving the public, in terms of everything that's written in the manual, but oftentimes is not really followed. So he uncovered massive corruption within the department, everything from selling drugs and narcotics, gun running, you name it, Frank Serpico identified it. And after a number of years, he testified before several commissions. He exposed massive corruption within the department, and for all of his troubles, he also got shot in the head, and he lost hearing in one of his ears. But he was one of the really early leaders in police reform in the United States in terms of really providing a basis for ethical behavior for police officers, and that's why I say he was really one of my heroes, because having been in law enforcement and seeing some of the things that happened firsthand, it just really resonated with me, particularly as a youngster who aspired at that time to have a career in law enforcement.
Now, for those of us who have seen the movies, how accurate is the movie portraying the facts of his case?
Relatively accurate, with the exception that the conditions were a lot worse than what the movie portrayed. Frank Serpico generally carried 2 firearms, sometimes 3 firearms. He was watched constantly by his colleagues. He was under investigation on numerous occasions, not for anything that he did wrong, but the fact that he was considered a rat within the New York City Police Department. Serpico was a detective, and the night he was shot, there was a code that issued in the New York City Police Department. There was a call for help, and no one showed up for Frank Serpico. He laid in a corridor in a drug house, basically bleeding to death. Finally, someone had the wherewithal to come to his rescue. But that was sort of a warning shot from the police department that, we're only going to tell you one more time that you can't be a rat in this police department, or else you're going to pay a price for that. But he was a model of integrity, and for me, really a model for what police officers ought to be about. And he made one statement that was really, really always resonated with me. He said, either you're a crook or you're a cop. You can't be the same thing. And he decided in his career he wanted to be a cop, a good cop.
Okay. Now, since that case, we have heard of other cases of police corruption throughout this country, and one famous one in New Orleans not that many years ago, and so on. So I wonder if really that case somehow made a difference in the consciousness of public administrators to say we need to keep a clean act here.
Well, I think it's a great observation, really a good question. the Serpico case, in many respects, was the first salvo in police reform. And for people in serving in the public, and the whole idea when you serve in the public interest is the idea that all of this is a higher calling. Because as I always tell my students, we are agents of the sovereign. I mean, I can use the university as an example. You know, we work at the behest of our students. We're supposed to have high standards, high ethics, do the right thing, not some of the time, but all the time. And make no mistake, we're all human and we make mistakes. But when you have knowledge of a particular incident or procedure that is improper, it's incumbent upon you to address it. And that's the thing that I really liked about that movie that inspired me a lot. But in terms of public administration, to sort of relate that, because some of the stuff I do has to do with criminal justice policy in particular, when we're in these positions and we take an oath or we pledge to do what we're supposed to do, public administrators are constantly observed. It's very transparent. They see what we do. I always have this joke with my students in class. I said, would it make any difference if you saw me down the Stagger Inn smoking a blunt one night? And, of course, there's a lot of laughter, but the reality is it should make a difference. It should make a difference to you. And if it doesn't, then perhaps you're in the wrong profession. I don't have to tell you about all the Illinois governors we've passed through
in jail.
at various points in time. But the whole idea is, and we understand people are not perfect, but the whole idea is we still have to make that concerted effort to do the right thing, even in this very dynamic, challenging environment when politics and other issues are in discussion and part of the process.
Okay. There was another person on which you wrote, which is much less known. His name was Thomas Mott Osborne. And you may want to tell our audience why he was important.
Thomas Mott Osborne was a prison reformer, and he really helped reform the prison system. Before Thomas Mott Osborne came along, the prison system was really a very draconian process. And I always used the Texas Department of Corrections many years ago. He was a reformer that really started a humanistic approach to treating prisoners, and it really had to do a lot with the equitable treatment of prisoners during his period of time. And he really was one of the great reformers as well. And a lot of these people like Thomas Mott Osborne, Frank Serpico, and others, they have to understand that this is sort of an evolutionary process. If you look at prisons today, there are elements of what Thomas Mott Osborne tried to do in terms of making these massive reforms in prison life. And particularly it's really important now because of all the legal issues that are occurring in prisons where prison officials have been sued for inhumane treatment. That happened in Missouri several years ago when third-party government interceded and was contracted out to have a private party control prisoners. Well, they came in and some dogs bit some prisoners and they were ultimately sued. Thomas Mott Osborne was really one of the early reformers that really dealt with some of these issues in terms of prison reform.
There is a saying out there, I'm sure you have heard about it, that says that you can tell about a country when you look at its prison system. So my question to you is, what can we say about the United States when we look at this prison system?
As you probably well know, we incarcerate probably more people on the planet than anyone else. And the fundamental question you have to ask, and I look at this in terms of public policy, which I teach, is that really making a difference? I mean, if you look at our penal system compared to other countries, our crime rates have not really reduced. And part of this, I think, is simply of an evolving culture over time and sort of a function of a very free democracy, open society to a certain degree, which no one wants to trade. I certainly don't. But when we incarcerate so many people in the United States and the crime rates do not go down, that's just send a clear message, I think, that we need to do something else besides simply incarcerate people. Why are they going to jail? What are the things that lead them to criminality in the United States? You can look at poverty. You can look at lack of education. You can look at a whole bunch of factors. But pinpointing that precisely is very, very difficult to do. One of the big issues in the United States is our prison system is so over-capacitated, if you will, that now we're in the process of releasing people who probably should be incarcerated. There was a recent Supreme Court decision that really ties in with public administration, where the court said, and it was a 5-4 decision, that the California Penal Institution had to release prisoners or build new prisons because the conditions were so bad that it was a violation of the Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment. If that wasn't an indicator that we need to do something different, I don't know what is. Yeah. And one of the problems we've had, too, with respect to population in prison has to do with the massive incarceration of low-level drug offenders. And this gets to be a politically charged discussion sometimes when you start talking about that, but a very conservative commentator that I used to listen to a lot, his name was William F. Buckley, many years ago, over 35 years ago, talked about legalizing certain types of drugs because he foresaw this coming many, many, many years ago. But make no mistake, there are people who need to be incarcerated. We also execute a lot of people in the United States, which is another issue dealing with penal systems and penal reform. And there's no, at least from the evidence I've read, there's no evidence that that really deters crime at all.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, talking about that, I mean, this is a perfect segue for the next question I have for you. As you mentioned, we have a huge number of people incarcerated. According to the latest statistics I read, it's 707 people per 100,000
yes.
of the population, which is huge. I mean, other countries has only a few in that regard. Isn't the issue of drugs that you mentioned a major one? Because, I mean, some people, especially after the financial crisis of 5 years ago, they say, how come someone who is just smoking marijuana, which now is becoming legal either for medical reasons or for recreational reasons in some states, how come that person gets a stiff prison term while all those people who were behind the financial crisis that created this major issue globally with the economy are free and getting these bonuses and other kind of things?
That's a great question. And that sort of relates back to the course I teach in public policy. Actually, that came up in a recent class that just ended in terms of why certain policies seem to be implemented and enforced greater than others. I don't have a pat answer for that per se, but if you look at the United States, and one of the models that we use in public policy is the elite mass model, where the idea that those at the top 1% of the economy, those who are wealthy families, and this is sort of an overgeneralization, it's not my model, but this is one of the models we look at, sort of influenced the public policy, if you will, in the United States. So someone like low-level drug users, people who are in possession of marijuana, it's not surprising to me they might be treated differently than those who caused the stock crash. I mean, it really opens up a really nice line of inquiry because how would you characterize corporate crime in terms of the deleterious effects it has had on the economy and the lives of so many people in the United States? To me, that represents a clear and present danger too, but we just simply think differently about that. And part of that is characterized by the media to a certain degree and those very, very powerful interest groups who sort of influence, at least to some degree, influence what we see and hear every day. If you think about how we are bombarded with information, one of the big issues comes up is how credible is that information? And to whom is this information being disseminated to and for what purpose? And all of these factors sort of lead into that. But the idea of someone who might crash the stock market, it is viewed in many instances as not quite as bad as that low-level drug user. And we can always debate that issue. I'm sure there were people who come over here and debate it differently, but I don't see that ending or changing in the short run in the United States.
Well, that's an interesting observation, because basically what you're saying is money talks.
Well, one could definitely say that.
Yeah.
I mean, and this comes up a lot. I mean, those interest groups in the United States that are well organized, well financed, have great lobbying with Congress, do well. Classic example. When President Obama tried to introduce some legislation dealing with gun control, there was not, I don't believe, one member of Congress who was willing to go to battle with the National Rifle Association, even though privately many of those individuals felt this is a good thing. But because the National Rifle Association has money, influence, and power, and the ability to influence votes, it became a critical issue. And that legislation that he was proposing didn't go very far. In fact, it really wasn't entertained seriously by members of Congress.
Yeah. Well, and talking about that, in this country we have a disproportionate incarceration of minorities, particularly
Yes.
African Americans. So here's the question. Is that because most African Americans are not wealthy, Or is this an actual case of racism when it comes to sentencing and law enforcing towards those particular groups?
That's a great question. Depends on the literature you read, depends on the statistics you look at. There is a real issue in terms of, if you look at the number of homicides that are committed in the United States, disproportionately African Americans lead the way, even though historically they're a small part of the population. Having said that, though, if you look at some of the environments these people live in, how they've been socialized, it's not really surprising that that's the case. And by the way, those typically are black-on-black types of crimes. So it's one of those areas that when you try to think about the disproportionate number of African Americans incarcerated, this has historically always been the case in the United States. The problem is, it starts before they are even in the adult system. Once they start being stopped and arrested and get into the juvenile justice system, the longer they're in the juvenile justice system, there's almost a certainty that they will in fact end up in the adult system. In St. Louis, for example, several years ago, there was a judge. Can't think of the judge's name offhand, but this judge was really concerned about this. And he was did his own research, and he found out that individuals, black and white, committing the same crime as juveniles were sentenced differently for the same crime. That was his observation, that was his research, not mine. But you can look at that across the country, and it seems to be a pattern of practice, if you will. And it's not to say that all of these institutions are racist. However, you can't deny there's something different going on here that has to be looked at. Yeah. There are some anomalies that we have to look at. Yeah. But make no mistake, young African American males, Latino males, in particular age cohort, they really commit most of the violent crime in the United States against their same racial group.
Yeah. Now, you were mentioning politics before, and the people of our generation, remember all these kind of things of being tough on crime began with the Nixon era, and even today, a lot of politicians run on a platform of being tough on crime, and because of that, they got some legislation that had to do with mandatory minimums, which pretty much handcuff the ability of a judge like the one you mentioned to have certain leeway in understanding the real issues. Isn't mandatory minimums also an issue when it comes to this high rates of incarceration? Absolutely.
No question about it. No question about it. That's a huge issue in the United States. Not only mandatory minimums, but I'm pretty sure you remember 3 strikes and you're out.
Yeah.
Those types of laws. There was a case in California several years ago where a gentleman committed a felony. It was his 3rd felony. The first 2 felonies were, I think it was maybe a car theft, 2 car thefts. And the 3rd, he stole pizza over the statutory limit, which made it a felony. And he was incarcerated in a California penal institution for 20 years. Based on that 3rd felony of stealing pizza over the statutory limit, which made it a felony.
Yeah.
To me, that's not equitable. Yeah. That's not equitable at all. And I worry about these not only from just being a citizen or a professor, but and I'm quite proud. I'm a curriculum member of the ACLU, and I've done work with the ACLU, and I'm concerned about civil liberties in the United States. And when you see these types of things happening, you have to ask the bigger questions, particularly the big policy questions. How can we change this? What difference can we make? Yesterday in my office, I got a call from a young lady from East St. Louis. This is really fascinating. And she said she wanted to talk to someone in the department. There was only one in the department there, so I talked to her. And she said, Dr. Taylor, can we do anything about crime and corruption and some of the things that are going on in East St. Louis? I don't want my city to just die away. I want to make it a better place. So we talked for about 45 minutes, very similar to what we're doing now. And I said, well, you have to start one block at a time, one neighborhood at a time, one community at a time, but you have to try to change the way people think, which is hard to do. And then you have to ask some tough questions about the leadership in certain areas. I'm not picking on East St. Louis. We could use any city, St. Louis, Boston, Chicago. It doesn't make any difference. But to change these conditions, it does start not only at the bottom, but you also have to have some sponsors at the top that's going to help you along the way. And sometimes it's very difficult to do. Yeah. But these incarceration rates, the mandatory minimums, the 3 strikes, you're out, these types of laws, those are what I call technology fixes. We talk about that in the policy literature. They are really addressing the symptoms of a much more intractable root problem. And the reason they do it because in many instances they don't have the cognitive ability to figure out what to do exactly. And then if they do focus on a particular problem, there's usually not the long-term political will or the resources to stay committed. There was a gentleman, his name was Oscar Newman. He wrote a book called Defensible Space. His addressing crime dealt with this. He said, this is how we solve crime. He said, solve crime in urban communities. Every time we build a new structure, we essentially build it like a fortress. We limit the ingress and egress points. We have small windows, and that way we'll be free of crime. Well, no, you're not free of crime. That's simply a short-term fix to a much more intractable problem, and treating those root causes is a real challenge.
Well, in fact, I mean, in terms of the penal system, you find big differences between the United States and Western Europe, to give you an example, where they have a much lower rates of crime, especially violent crimes and that sort of things. But there is also a qualitative difference here. In this country, it seems that we emphasize punishment, while in Western Europe, the emphasis is in rehabilitation. Mm-hmm. Can we learn something from that?
I think we can learn a lot from it, but I wonder if we have the political will to really address it. We are different cultures. Some of those cultures are very homogeneous. I mean, they're not like the United States. We're so diverse, so many different ethnic groups, so many different perspectives on crime and punishment. And that's just not part of our history. And I don't see that changing in the long term, in the short term, but I think we can learn something from that for those who are astute enough to really address it. There are a lot of people who really don't believe rehabilitation works. I mean, we talk about rehabilitation, but does it really work? And the evidence on that is somewhat mixed. It depends. And it really gets back to the earlier question in terms of addressing people in that young cohort, young men in particular. If you can get to them early, when they get into the juvenile justice system, that's when you really want to start the rehabilitation. By the time they're in the adult system, it's very, very, very difficult to do. I'm not saying it's impossible. It's a really, really major challenge. And then, particularly in this economy, with shrinking resources, do we really have the political will to do that? Or are we simply paying lip service to it? And those are policy questions that have to be asked. And we have to ask those of our elected officials. But we have so many different things competing for scarce dollars. Mm-hmm. And particularly in the United States, we want quick fixes. Well, some of these things take a long time. Yeah. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, he wanted to sort of re-engineer the United States in terms of social policy. That didn't go too well for a whole variety of reasons. So a lot of this is tied into the political system, into the political will of a society, and to really the consciousness of we the people as Americans. And that, I think, is going to be a really, really big challenge. I mean, look what's happened now with the massive immigration in the United States. All these people coming here to gain a better life. Some of them don't have any education. They're bare bones in terms of what they bring to the country. And some have argued, we just need to send all these people back. It's a lot more complex than that. Yeah. A lot more complex. And the short answer, that might get us a temporary stay, but in the long run, it's not going to solve the problem. And really, I don't know if we ever really solved the problems. We sort of do something called satisficing. We never really optimize. All we do is satisfy, as Herbert Simon, Nobel laureate, talked about. We just satisfy because we have so many competing things in the United States that we have to deal with on a daily and yearly basis.
Well, talking about politics again, one thing that happened with policies and politics since the 1970s regarding police departments was to give them more resources, to hire more policemen. Even we went a few years ago to an extreme of giving grants to police departments for things that they didn't really need, like a SWAT team for a town of 10,000 people. They say, do you need a SWAT team? That sort of things. But on the other hand, I don't think people realize that there have been some major technological advances in law enforcement, like using geographic information systems to detect what crimes are. Yes. And so my question to you is, we have more police. Do we have a better police too?
Well, more police and new technology does not equate to better policing. Those are good to have when you have it. It sort of gets back to an article I read in the Criminal Justice Journal. It was called Militarizing Mayberry. from the old Andy Griffin show, maybe RFD, whatever it was. And the question became, do you really need all these types of advanced weaponry and technological advancements, if you will? And depends on who you ask, depends on the community. And particularly now in the 21st century where the threat of terrorism is paramount. Who knows? Several years ago, there was a shootout in Los Angeles. There were 2 armed assailants, and they were on a mission to destroy. It was a big issue. I think it was in the 90s it occurred. But they were just 2 people, and the Los Angeles Police Department SWAT team could not stop them. They actually had to borrow weapons from local gun shops, and it still didn't stop them. They went on for over an hour.
Yeah.
And so even then, with the best trained, arguably one of the best trained police departments in the United States, with the latest technology and weaponry, they still were unable to effectively stop just 2. Now, what happens if you have a small group of terrorists or a small group of committed criminals? How good is that technology really going to be? So a big part of it has to do with not just the technology, but how you think about crime. How do you plan for these types of eventualities that do occur from time to time in the United States? So on the one hand, I see the use of technology, and in some particular cities, I understand the need for advanced weaponry. But is that really going to solve the problem or address these issues the way we think they are? Because I don't think that's the case.
Okay. Well, I have many more questions for you, but we are running out of time. So let me ask you one final question, and for that we have about a minute and a half. What is your next big project?
Well, besides being department chair, I think my next big project really is a follow-up article on municipal bankruptcies in the United States, which I presented at a conference at the Midwest Political Science Association in Chicago. And at the time, excuse me, at the time I was actually doing the paper, there were issues dealing with municipal bankruptcies in the United States. And a lot of people don't realize this, but municipalities can file bankruptcies under certain provisions under Chapter 9. States cannot, but municipalities can.
That's Detroit.
Yes, there's Detroit. But I was looking at the spillover effect for local communities and the implications for local government and for also police departments. Mm-hmm. And what does that suggest in terms of the strain it would put on the surrounding communities for their particular services that they're providing? Yeah. So that's sort of the follow-up on the project that I'm working on.
And that may be a topic for another conversation in Segway.
Love to have it.
Well, thank you very much to Dr. Maurice Taylor of the Department of Public Administration and Policy Analysis at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. And next week, we're going to have Dr. Jeff Manuel of the Department of Historical Studies at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, who will be talking about World War I, for which we are celebrating, so to speak, a centenary now, and its impact in Illinois. So stay tuned.
This has been Segway with Dean Aldemaro Romero, a production of the Department of Mass Communications at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. All rights reserved, 2014.